You got one? All right. So I thought I was going to try.
All right, we've got the defendants represented by counsel. Got the witness back on the stand. Mr. Goff, are you ready to proceed?
I believe so, Your Honor.
All right. I remind you are under oath. Let's go ahead and get the panel.
All right, for the jury, please. Please be seated.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready to go ahead and proceed with the evidence. Mr. Goff.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Agent Seacrist.
Good afternoon.
Do I recall correctly that it was you who called Roddy Bryan
When?
initially? You reached out to Mr. Bryan.
I did. I knocked on his door.
It wasn't Mr. Bryan looking for the spotlight.
That's correct.
And is it fair to say at this point that you needed his cooperation?
I desired his cooperation, yes.
You wanted it. You wanted his cooperation.
Sure.
And that's because under Georgia law, witnesses are not required to talk to you.
No one is required to talk to me.
Because you are not a federal agent.
I'm sorry?
You're not a federal agent. You're a GBI agent.
That's correct.
And you don't have the power to compel witnesses to speak to you.
That's correct.
So they do it voluntarily.
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Bryan had already given several statements to the Glenn County Police Department, had he not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And he'd already given the Glenn County Police Department his cell phone several times. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But the first thing that you need to do is you need to secure his cell phone again. That's your first mission, is to secure his cell phone.
My first mission?
Yes, sir. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this now famous video, wasn't there?
Controversy. I don't know about controversy as far as the video. There was... People did not like what the video showed, for sure.
For sure. And there was a lot of speculation out there about the video.
And I'm going to object to any speculation, Judge.
Oh, I'm not asking him to provide details. I'm just asking whether he'll acknowledge that there was a need for the GBI to obtain that cell phone.
Go ahead.
Was there a need?
Yes, sir.
There was.
Okay. In fact, as it turned out, there was another important video in this case, or set of videos. Were there not?
If you're referring to the videos at his house, yes, sir.
The Night Owl videos.
That's correct.
Somehow, in their exhaustive investigation, the Glynn County Police Department, for whatever reason, did not obtain those videos.
That's correct.
And you were unaware of the existence of those videos until Mr. Roddy Bryan brought them to your attention.
Yes, sir.
Now, directing your attention to May 11th, did you tell Roddy Bryan that the past week had probably been one of the worst of his life?
Yes, sir.
And he agreed with you.
That's correct.
I believe you've already testified that the McMichael defendants had been arrested.
That's correct.
The GBI director, Vic Reynolds, had given a press conference, and your
And I'm
agency.
going to object to anything from the press conference, Judge. That's hearsay.
I have no intention of going into the contents of the press conference. But your boss, former Cobb County DA Vic Reynolds, at that time GBI director, had actually given a press conference in this case.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
You were physically present when he did so.
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay. And whether you were present, you were aware there was a press release.
I'm aware there were press releases going on.
And when you were speaking with Mr. Bryan, what you described as media and quote-unquote other entities were blowing the situation up even more.
Objection to relevance, Your Honor, in terms of the relevance of what Agent Seacrist thought about the media.
Based on the conversations we had yesterday outside the presence of the jury, I thought the import of this line of question was clear.
If you're asking the court that, no.
Okay.
So,
Well, I'm at the court's direction, but the circumstances surrounding under which statements are made is relevant to their admissibility.
okay. So ask your question again.
Did you describe when you spoke with Mr. Bryan the media and quote-unquote other entities quote-unquote blowing it up even more? Directing your attention to page 12 of the transcript.
And Judge, I'll renew my objection.
Yeah, but let's see where this is going. Go ahead.
Page
Refresh your
12.
memory, look at page 12 of the
Yes,
transcript.
sir. On which transcript?
The 511.
Okay.
And at any point in time, if you're not sure what I'm asking you about, don't hesitate to let me know.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct.
All right. And you noted that the media was already parked out front of Mr. Bryan's residence when you first attempted to make contact with him.
Your Honor, again, relevance.
Okay, look, go ahead.
Yes, the media was there.
And that media craze only got worse in the days to follow.
The media was present.
Okay. And again on 5/13, 2 days later, when you speak with Mr. Bryan again, you acknowledge that the past 2 days have been, quote, difficult for Mr. Bryan, unquote.
Yes, sir.
Because there's even more media now.
Is that a quote?
I don't think that's a quote. But there were more media.
I'm sorry, you're asking me a question?
I'll move on. You discussed with Mr. Bryan the march through his neighborhood. Page 139 on your 513 transcript.
I do recall that.
You sympathize with unusual activity in the neighborhood.
Yes, sir.
You've previously agreed that in the context of this interview in May of 2020, that this was a neighborhood on edge.
That's correct.
And by this time, Mr. Bryan fears for his own personal safety and that of his
Objection
family.
to speculation.
Directing your attention to page 142 of what I believe is the JVD transcript.
So which transcript?
the transcript on his prior testimony in this trial.
Why don't you give her a date? Let's zero everybody in.
Fair enough. Volume 1 of the proceedings of May 13, 2021. Do you have that transcript, sir?
Not here on the stand with me, no, sir.
I think I have it. It's an excerpt of your testimony.
Okay, thank you. What page?
Directing your page to page 142.
I'm sorry, which statement, which part of it?
Page 142, lines 3 through 7.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall being asked whether Mr. Bryan and his fiancée related multiple occasions, incidents that gave them concern for their personal safety?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall Mr. Bryan's fiancée, Amy, giving you a threatening letter that she pulled out of her mailbox?
Hearsay, Judge. Anything in that letter is hearsay. And relevance as to Amy Elrod.
I'll
Who's not a
rephrase.
party in this case.
Thank you.
I'll rephrase. In the presence of Roddy Bryan, did his fiancée, Amy Elrod, give you a letter that she pulled out of her mailbox?
Same objection, Your Honor. I don't know if there's any
It's certainly not
evidence.
hearsay. We haven't gone into the contents of the
Yeah,
letter.
and what's the relevance of it? Is there any evidence that Mr. Bryan read the letter? I mean, what?
I'll rephrase. Did Mr. Bryan ask you to do something to help protect him?
I don't recall that directly. I
You
know there
did-
were general concerns about his personal safety,
Yes, sir.
and there were multiple conversations about it.
All right. Is it fair to say that Mr. Bryan was very much concerned about speaking with you at this time?
Objection to speculation, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. Would you describe Mr. Bryan as scared?
Not of me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean scared of you, but scared generally.
Because of the situation in the neighborhood, yes, sir.
Okay. And you still need his help.
I would like his assistance, yes.
And the last thing you want Mr. Bryan to do is freak out.
I don't want anybody to freak out.
You certainly don't want him to shut down because you want his help.
I'd like to get statements from anybody involved in an investigation.
Okay. Sir, I'm going to direct your attention to the bottom of page, the bottom half of page, I'm sorry, the bottom 2/3 of page 3 of the transcript, the 511 transcript. May I approach the witness, Chairman?
Yes.
Sir, I'm showing you an enlargement of page 3 of that transcript, that portion.
Is there an exhibit number?
No, this is not marked for the exhibit. The full transcript is already an exhibit, correct? Do you recall that conversation?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. Can you read that conversation to me?
From the ones you handed to me?
Yeah, or you can read the smaller print on the document, either way.
I stated, I do appreciate you. You said you would call me back, and you did. And you said you wanted to talk, and you are. I appreciate that. I want to tell you thank you. Like I told, Mr. Goff said, Kevin, and I responded, Kevin, yeah. It takes me a second sometimes. You know, at this point, you're a witness, you know. That's kind of what we've developed. Or I shouldn't say developed, but determined by listening to all the evidence and the statements and watching videos. There are things that we have questions on, and that we'd like to I guess be a little more specific than what we've been able to see, you know. But I do appreciate you coming in.
And that is what you said?
Yes, sir, that is what I said at that point in time.
Help? It was important for you to let Mr. Bryan know that he was a witness in this matter.
It was important for him to know that I appreciated him calling me back like he said he would after my initial contact with him. It was important that he know what his role was at this point in time. And I wanted him to understand that I was looking at this objectively from a fresh set of eyes and not going strictly off what Glenn County Police Department had relayed.
Now, when you told him that you had reviewed the previous statements to the Glenn County Police Department and the other evidence in the case, you weren't lying to him, were you?
I was not.
You did actually. You had all that information available to you.
Yes, sir.
And you know that the Glenn County Police Department had referred to him as a witness.
I don't recall that specifically, but if it's in there, it's in there.
Okay. Well, you reviewed their case file.
I did, in pieces, I would say.
And when you became involved in this case, the Glenn County Police Department listed him as a witness.
Asked and answered.
I don't think so, but I'll defer to the court.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead. If you know, go ahead.
The Glenn County Police Department had identified him as a witness in this matter.
I don't recall.
Okay, fair enough. But you told him that he was a witness.
I told him at that point in time.
Which would be consistent, as far as you know, with everything he had been led to believe.
Objection to speculation as far as what Mr. Bryan was led to believe.
I'll move on. You had Mr. Bryan execute a consent form, I believe.
It's in evidence. It should be up there.
Now, Coach Woodshire. I'm showing you what's been marked State's Exhibit 197. Thank you. I believe you read that to the jury earlier.
Yes, sir, I did.
Where in there does it tell Mr. Bryan what he's under investigation for?
It doesn't.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
I would add, though, that he knew what the investigation was about, being as the whole case was around Ahmaud Arbery and his death.
Well, we'll come back to that. Maybe I slept through it earlier, but where was the Miranda form that you used on this occasion?
He was not under arrest. Miranda is only required when somebody's being questioned while they're in custody. At no time was Mr. Bryan in custody during these questioning. As a matter of fact, he was advised from the beginning that he was free to leave and that he was free to stop talking at any time, to which Mr. Goff was present during those conversations.
Well, let's be clear. You were under no legal obligation to give Mr. Bryan Miranda rights, but you could have.
There was no reason to.
But you could have.
I could do a lot of things, but there's no reason to read him Miranda if he is not in custody, or there's no chance of him being put into custody at that time.
You've never Mirandized somebody who wasn't in custody?
I do a lot of different things depending on an investigation. The statutes and case law gives us parameters for which we have to work through. What I do in one case may be different than another based on the circumstances of that case. There's no straight cookie cutter approach to this. The point is to always get the information that's needed in the investigation so that you can make a reasonable decision on charges should they be made or not.
But in this case, there was a specific reason why you did not Mirandize Mr. Bryan.
That's correct, because he was not in custody.
When you fill out a Miranda form, are you not required to tell the subject what you're investigating them for?
No, sir.
No? You don't do that.
Objection to relevance of a Miranda form, Judge, when we've already established that a Miranda form was not given in this case.
With all respect, the credibility of all witnesses is a matter for the jury. Even police
It's the
officers.
state. He sort of said he didn't Mirandize.
All right. You never used the terms citizen arrest in this conversation, any of these interviews.
Neither myself or Mr. Bryan discussed citizen arrest. No, sir.
Okay. You discussed other legal concepts, did you not?
Which ones?
Such as self-defense.
I don't recall that specifically. Do you have a reference?
No. You don't recall that at all.
If you have a reference, to refresh my memory, but I don't recall that specifically.
Well, we'll circle back to that. You did discuss whether Mr. Bryan was scared on the side of the road.
Again, do you have a specific reference?
Did you discuss whether Mr. Bryan took defensive action to pull away from Mr. Arbery when he felt Mr. Arbery was trying to get in his truck? Did you not testify to that earlier today?
Not in relation to self-defense, but in relation to the series of events that occurred prior to Mr. Arbery's death, then yes, we discussed that.
All right. Now, shortly into the interview, concern became apparent as to what your intentions were, did it not?
Concern for who?
There was concern on the part of Mr. Bryan as to what your intentions were.
Objection to speculation about concern of Mr. Bryan.
But we don't have to speculate, Your Honor.
Let's rephrase.
Directing your attention to page 21 of the transcript,
Which transcript?
the 511 transcript. 18 pages. After this colloquy on page 3. Did you get a chance to review page 21?
Is there a certain area that you want me to, that you're referencing?
Tell us about the part where the interview stops. Matter of fact, you just go. I don't have line numbers on my copy.
Okay.
But from the part where it says, okay, I'll step outside a minute.
Okay. In the beginning, I guess to give some context, in the beginning of this interview, Mr. Goff had even reminded Mr. Bryan, while I was telling him about the voluntariness of the interview, Mr. Goff reminded him that at any point we could pause the interview so that Mr. Bryan could confer with his attorney on any questions he may have. And that's, I think, what is occurring right here. Mr. Bryan starts off on this page stating, he asked me, and I don't exactly remember right now what exactly he said, other than he was just saying that.
Objection, Judge, may we approach?
That wasn't me.
Well, you directed him to it.
No, I directed him to the breaking the conversation.
May we approach, Your Honor?
attention to line 4. Well, it's the 4th line. I know there are no line numbers, but line 4. How does this part of the conversation begin?
I stated, okay, I'll step outside a minute.
And then who says what next?
Mr. Goff says, no, you step outside, or I'm sorry, not you step outside, we'll step outside. And Mr. Bryan said, yeah, I was going to step outside. And I said, yeah, that's fine, Roddy, have a seat.
And then what do I say?
Mr. Goff says, right, you stay, we're stepping out.
And Mr. Bryan says,
Okay.
and then you say,
No, you're good, you're good.
and then I say,
We're stepping out. Okay,
and then you and I stepped out.
that's correct.
And when we came back in, what did you tell Mr. Bryan?
I know not everybody talks to the police every day, and I know this is a very stressful situation, but you know, we're going to be okay here.
And Mr. Bryan says,
Okay,
okay. And then you say,
all right, we're going to be okay. I mean, nothing has changed. When we're done here, you're going home. Okay?
and Mr. Bryan said,
Okay.
because he's just a witness.
I believe that our question or our conversation outside was to Roddy's nervousness about talking to police and his trouble recalling events. And I believe you were speaking for your client as to his ability to recall events.
Because it's an issue. It's an issue when you're dealing with him that day.
I don't remember it being as much of an issue for him as it was for you.
Really? Okay. All right. Now, on May 11th, Mr. Bryan gave you an hour-plus interview, did he not?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Hour and 15?
Something like that.
And on May 13th, he comes back and gives you a 2-hour interview?
That's correct.
And he speaks with you in his home, does he not?
The May 13th interview for 2 hours?
In addition to the 2-hour interview at the DNR headquarters, he invites you into his home and meets with you in his home.
That's correct. After discussions with you, it was advised that we could go to his home. I believe that was to download the Night Owl camera system. It was not an interview. It was a matter of gathering evidence.
And you spoke with him out in the front yard.
Not about the facts of the case as much as it was the, again, the logistics of the video and everything else.
And you're speaking with him down when you're getting his fingerprints.
After you and I had already had a conversation where I promised I wouldn't ask any questions about the case during that time because you weren't present.
Because you had built a relationship of trust with Mr. Bryan.
Which I try to do with all of my witnesses and all of my people that I discuss with cases, whether it be subjects, whether it be witnesses, to the point where I've gotten text messages thanking me from people that I've arrested because I've treated them fairly.
And in case it wasn't clear earlier, in all these interviews that transpire over several hours, you're discussing a lot of different subjects.
Yes.
Path of travel is only one of those.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Path of travel, the video, the now famous video, that's one of the subjects of those conversations.
You mean the recorded interview conversations?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I mean, you're not grilling Mr. Bryan for 2 hours at a time, an hour and a half at a time about this one subject.
No, these interviews are very conversational in nature about the events that happened on that day, before and after.
And it was through no fault of yours, but Mr. Bryan nevertheless had trouble articulating what was going on that day.
No, sir.
He did it?
You said it was no fault
It was no fault of yours. You were trying to work with him.
I was working with him. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, on May 11th and May 13th, did Mr. Bryan appear at any time to be mentally unstable?
No, sir.
Did he appear to be under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or other intoxicants?
No, sir.
Was Mr. Bryan loud or boisterous?
No, sir.
Did he come across to you as gleeful or bragging or boastful?
No, sir.
Did he strike you as someone seeking attention, seeking the spotlight?
No, sir.
Did Mr. Bryan drop F-bombs or otherwise use profanity when you were talking to him?
No, sir.
Was Mr. Bryan in any way disrespectful to you?
He was not.
Okay. Now, there are times in the transcript where you and Mr. Bryan are discussing the deceased in this case.
That's
Mr.
correct.
Arbery, by his first name.
That's correct.
Okay. In doing so, you didn't mean any disrespect.
I don't see that as disrespectful.
Okay. And certainly when Mr. Arbery said his name, you didn't take that as a disrespect towards Mr. Arbery.
When Mr. Arbery said his name,
When Mr. Bryan said Mr. Arbery's first name, you didn't take that as a sign of disrespect.
no, sir.
Did you ask Mr. Bryan how far he got in school on either May 11th or May 13th?
Not to my recollection, but I think he did tell me that he graduated from Brunswick, if I remember correctly.
Did you ask him whether he had any learning disabilities?
No, sir.
Did you ask him whether he could read and write the English language?
I don't recall specifically if I asked that one.
You don't recall him replying most of it?
I do recall that. Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Bryan never denied following Mr. Arbery, did he?
That's correct.
And while he might not have used the word, Mr. Bryan never denied angling his vehicle ahead of Mr. Arbery.
He never denied angling his vehicle in that direction. His choice of words changed drastically from the point of the Glenn County interview to the point of his interview with me.
I'm sorry, did I ask you whether he changed his wording, or did I ask you whether he denied angling his vehicle in front of Mr. Arbery?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness is allowed to explain his answer, which I believe is what he just did.
What a witness does is answer yes or no, and then they can explain.
Why don't you state your question again? Go ahead.
Roddy Bryan never denied during his interview with you that he angled his vehicle ahead of Mr. Arbery.
That's correct. He never denied. He just changed the descriptive words that he used in his involvement in the incident that day.
Didn't you just tell the jury when the district attorney was playing this reenactment? Didn't you just tell this jury, as you pull the truck in where the driveway is in the ditch, didn't you just show them on the video him angling and say that he did that? You just didn't use the word.
Yes, sir. He said that he did that during the reenactment video with me, but the wording was different than his explanation when he was interviewed by the Glenn County Police Department.
But based on your video, whether he used the same words or not, he conveyed the same meaning.
He conveyed the same meaning with different intent.
You know what's in Mr. Bryan's mind?
I don't know what's in his mind, but the use of the English language and the words can give some insight into a person's intent.
Are you trying to speculate as to what was in Mr. Bryan's mind?
I'm not speculating in what is in his mind. I guess I would be explaining what the meaning that I took to those words and what I would say is a general meaning to those words.
Roddy Bryan never denied cutting in ahead of Mr. Arbery, did he?
At which point?
At any point. In your conversation with him, did he ever deny cutting in ahead of Mr. Arbery?
No, he was factually correct in his movements that day during his interview with me.
Okay. Now, beyond that, what you're really doing in this video and this narrative you've just given the jury is you're largely speculating, aren't you?
About?
What happened?
I'm giving insight on what I was told was that had happened on the day of the incident.
Okay. Was that Mr. Bryan's testimony, the words you were using when the video was playing, or is that your spin on it?
That would be me paraphrasing what Mr. Bryan told me during that reenactment video.
Mr. Bryan let you know that he didn't think you could do this.
Do the reenactment video?
Mr. Bryan let you know many times that he was struggling to remember events 2.5 months later.
Which is not uncommon for anybody that has to recall events afterwards. But it doesn't stop me from being able to ask the questions. That's my job as an investigator.
Because you needed this reenactment video.
Actually, you offered the video prior to the interview. You referenced that Mr. Bryan had a hard time remembering the path of travel in a narrative format, and that he was willing to take that path of travel after the interview.
So you took that as the green light to put words in Mr. Bryan's mouth.
I never put words in Mr. Bryan's mouth.
One moment, John. We're making sure we're looking at the same thing. Yes. Sir, is it fair to say that what you did on May 13th in that car was a rehearsal before you recorded it?
I'm sorry, repeat that question?
You rehearsed this video with Mr. Bryan before you recorded it.
Yes, there was a discussion as far as Mr. Bryan's ability to recall exactly what happened. So we did refresh the events prior to actually doing the recording.
So it was practiced. You did a practice run before you turned the video on.
It was a run to refresh his memory because he was having a hard time with the path of travel.
May I show you the investigative summary that you prepared?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Your investigative summary indicates that...
Objection to hearsay, Your Honor, from the summary. If he's trying to refresh his recollection, then that's one thing, but not read from an actual document.
Have you refreshed your recollection now?
I don't believe the witness ever said that he couldn't remember anything.
I'll rephrase. In your written summary, you acknowledge the difficulty Mr. Bryan had in determining his path of travel 2.5 months later.
Yes, just like I stated earlier, he needed an opportunity to refresh his memory.
And it was only after you refreshed his memory that the video was turned on.
I did not refresh his memory. It was impossible for me to refresh Mr. Bryan's memory. I was not there on February 23rd. I could only go off the statements that Mr. Bryan provided.
Oh, but it was possible for you to refresh his memory, wasn't it?
Objection to ask and answer, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. Mr. Bryan has repeatedly said he's having trouble recalling the events of that day, and in all the times that you met with him and all the times he expressed difficulty, did you ever once offer to show him a copy of his own statement?
No, sir.
You had both of his statements from the Glenn County Police Department at that time, right? You had the video and the transcript. I'm sorry, you had the videos. Okay. Did you? You've indicated you reviewed them. Did you ever once give Mr. Bryan an opportunity to review what he said 2.5 months earlier?
it wouldn't be standard to have somebody review their statement after the fact. The whole point of the GBI coming in to do another investigation of this incident was to try to start the investigative process from the beginning and basically get a fresh start. I wanted Mr. Bryan's statement from his recollection right then, and I could compare it to what he had said earlier and try to determine if there were discrepancies based off memory issues or if there were discrepancies based off of, I'll call it ill intent.
Where in your 5-page written summary do you ever reference Roddy Bryan attempting to run over Mr. Arbery with his truck?
I don't think it's in there.
Would you like to review it?
It's right here, this one?
Yeah.
I don't believe it's in there.
Okay. To be fair, you weren't investigating Roddy Bryan for an aggravated assault with a motor vehicle, were you?
I was investigating Roddy's involvement in the death of Ahmaud Arbery.
Well, certainly, if he had told you that he tried to run Mr. Arbery over with his truck, that would have changed the character of your investigation.
Not necessarily.
Okay. You certainly would have included it in your 5-page summary, wouldn't you?
That's correct.
Because other agents for the GBI and your supervisors are looking at these things as they come in, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you previously testified about an incident where Mr. Arbery, from Mr. Bryan's perspective, appears to be getting in the vehicle.
That's correct.
Or trying.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, he expressed a fear to you later that he was going to try again.
That sounds familiar. Yes, sir.
Directing your attention to page 54 of what I believe is the May 13th transcript.
You said 54?
Page 54.
Okay.
Directing your attention to the middle, where Mr. Bryan begins with, "Well, at first." He tells you he's trying to get out of the way. 10th line down.
Yes, sir.
Now, he's trying to get out of the way. He says, for a split second, he says, "Oh my God, he's coming back at me." You
Yes.
recall that?
Yes, that's right before he continued following Mr. Arbery towards the intersection of Satilla and Holmes.
Yes. So he's telling you that I'm trying to stay as far back as I can from this dude.
Yes, but he had also turned around he was already going away from Mr. Arbery, and he had turned around to come back and follow him.
And when he turned around, and I got that video, that split second, then he's coming back at me, and I'm like, "Oh, expletive, excuse me," again. I don't want to use that 4-letter word.
I understand. Yes, right before he continues following him. Yes, sir.
So he says, and I started kind of evasive action, and I dropped the phone. Is that what he said?
Yes, sir.
GBA, you omitted a key portion of his statement, did you not? You don't know what I'm talking about. Directing your attention to page 40.
Of May 13th?
Yes. We would make May 13th. Do you recall Mr. Bryan specifically telling you that he never intended to strike Mr. Arbery?
On page 40?
I'm sorry, the top of page 41. What's your question for Mr. Bryan? Top of page 41.
I asked him, so, all right, so you never intentionally tried to run him off the road? Mr. Bryan says no. And I think this is referring to the time when he was trying to cut him off in the driveway. And so he's saying that he wasn't trying to actually run him over or hit him.
And actually, you're following up on what he's told you on page 38, where he told you that he got over in his path, but he was too far in front of Mr. Arbery to be a threat to him.
Page 38?
Yes, sir.
Too far in front of him to be running him off the road. That's correct.
Well, technically, if Mr. Arbery didn't stop running, he would have run into Mr. Bryan's truck.
Objection, Judge. Is there a question in there? And it's speculation.
In the context, Mr. Bryan's not denying that he attempted to block his path of travel. He's just pointing out to you that he was a good distance in front of him when he did that.
Objection to compound question, Your Honor.
You can break it down, or if the witness can try and answer that.
If he will, he will. If he won't, I'll rephrase.
Can you repeat it?
Mr. Bryan has acknowledged attempting to block Mr. Arbery's path of travel, but he's told you at page 38 that when he does that, he's sufficiently far in front of him that he's not threatening Mr. Arbery with his vehicle.
That's correct. He's saying that he is trying to stop his movement, but that he's too far in front to make contact. That's correct.
Now, we've discussed in generality Mr. Bryan's struggles reviewing the events of that day. Now, I've got some more specific questions, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take you out there. You're going to need that May 13th transcript again, probably. Okay? Mr. Bryan told you that it had been 2.5 months since this incident. That's page 3.
That's correct.
But he promises to do his best, doesn't he?
He says, I'll give you what I can recall.
All right. As far as what took place in front of his house, he tells you it all happened pretty quick, does he not? Page 6.
I believe that's correct, yes.
But now, you've already decided that you're going to direct the conversation, have you not? Directing your attention back to page 3. You agreed to, quote unquote, direct Roddy Bryan through what happened.
Where are you at?
Page 3 of your 530 of the 513
Yes, sir.
transcript. You use the words, direct Mr. Bryan.
I'm trying to find it. Give me just a second.
Which transcript are you looking
I thought I was looking at the May 13th.
at? Okay, that's what you're asking him to look at?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's in reference to, let me see. Conversations that you and I had, and I tried to ask open-ended questions to get responses, and it was advised that I probably needed to be a little bit more direct in the questioning to give him guidance on what I was wanting to discuss.
Well, let's be clear. You're not trying to trick Mr. Bryan here. You're simply trying to get the information.
That's correct.
But to do that, you have to direct him.
I have to ask direct questions, but again, a lot of that is based on conversations that Mr. Nagolf and I had regarding Roddy's ability to respond and understand open-ended questions as it related to the things that I was looking to ask about. So I believe you even referenced being more direct with him.
Because, as Mr. Bryan explained to you at page 22, it is hard for him to explain what happened out there.
You're talking about the bottom of the page?
I believe so.
Well, it says, what it actually says is, well, this is going to be hard to explain without kind of really showing you.
Mr. Bryan is telling you he can't put it into words.
Yes, like I explained earlier, Mr. Bryan had a hard time describing things in a narrative format when it came to the path of travel, but that's why he was willing to go afterwards and actually do the drive-through, because he could do it more in that kind of a setting versus just describing it narratively.
Yes, sir. And at page 23, well, before I get there, when you reviewed the Glenn County Police Department report, you did see the map and the squiggles that Mr. Bryan drew on it when he was interviewed by Detective Lowry?
So I knew that there was a map that they were referencing when I was reviewing the video. I actually don't recall seeing the map initially. I know that we got it at some point, but I don't recall actually being able to find it when I was preparing for the interview.
Well, it was fairly obvious at that point that Mr. Bryan's map-making skills would leave a lot to be desired.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Specifically, Mr. Bryan had trouble recalling details about the carjacking. Directing your attention to page 31.
I don't know of a carjacking.
Attempted carjacking?
I don't know.
I'm sorry, what do you call it when someone tries to get in your motor
You
vehicle?
just cut the witness off, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Explain.
I don't know of a carjacking. I know that if someone is being chased through a neighborhood, that there may be different ways that they may deal with that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But, for example, Mr. Bryan has difficulty recalling whether it is Mr. Arbery's right hand or his left hand which is closest to his door.
That's correct.
Now, you were asked previously whether the transcripts from May 11th and May 13th that you were referring to reflected the full conversation that took place in your car.
There was no conversation in my car on May 11th.
Directing your attention to page 148 of the motion transcript. Page 148. Do you recall being asked whether the transcript of the that goes with the reenactment video reflected the full conversation that took place in your car?
I stated that it reflects the time that we started the reenactment,
The time when you turned on the video.
when we started the reenactment.
Basically, you had so much trouble with Mr. Bryan the first time you went through this with him, you had to start all over again.
I wouldn't call it trouble. I would call it, again, it's been 2.5 months. He had difficulty relaying the exact version of the path of travel. It was better to do a refresh to allow him to refresh his memory before we actually recorded it. The flip side would have been, if we would have started recording it, it was wrong, it would become more confusing. So the idea was to get the best recollection that Mr. Bryan had on the video. And then so prior to that, we did the refresh drive around to make sure that he kind of knew where he was. And Mr. Goff and Mr. Bryan were on board with that during the whole time this occurred.
So when the transcript begins, go, that wasn't really go, was it?
Yes, sir, it was.
That was a do-over.
No, sir,
You would call it a mulligan?
I would not.
All right. Let's talk about the video transcript itself. Now, I believe you testified earlier that that's what Mr. Bryan told you. You know, what you related to this jury earlier today was true and accurate.
Are you referring to my paraphrasing of events on the video?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Directing your attention to page 2. You tell Mr. Bryan, let's start. You saw them going through. That's you leading Mr. Bryan, is it not?
No, sir. That's me just going back to information that Mr. Bryan had said to me as to how this started.
But you're the director of this little movie.
No, sir. What I'm doing is just going back after the refresh and the information that Mr. Bryan had already given and just referencing it during the video. It's like a way of recording it and getting it on record that this is what Mr. Bryan had provided to me, and he's acknowledging it by saying, uh-huh.
And then again on page 2, you're telling him, you kind of see him running.
Yes, sir. Which is, again, goes back to the information that he had already relayed to me during the interview and during the refresh of the drive through in the neighborhood.
And again on page 2, you're telling him you already knew.
I'm sorry, where's that? On page 2?
On page 2, we're still on page 2. You're telling
No,
him
sir.
telling him that Mr. Arbery is still in front of you.
No, sir.
No?
No. That is, I'm telling him, the direct quote here is, you already knew, and I use a word to reference Mr. Arbery, was going down that way in the direction that they were angling, or that Mr. Bryan was angling.
All right. Directing your attention to the bottom of page 2, Mr. Bryan's expressing uncertainty about the sequence of events, is he not? Bottom of page 2, he says, quote unquote, he was probably right beside me.
Yes, sir, that's correct, he does.
Page 3, about 8 lines up. You're telling him you're still going.
I'm not telling him, that's a question. The actual line says, you're still going, question mark.
And let's be clear, who's operating the motor vehicle for this video? Is that Mr. Bryan operating the motor vehicle?
No, sir. I'm operating my state-issued GBI truck, and I am following the path of travel and the directions that Mr. Bryan has given me.
Okay.
I'm even asking him about speeds and directions and angles and if I'm doing it correctly.
Well, what Mr. Bryan has told you is that he can't explain it. He needs to show you, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And he's already brought other police officers into his truck, has he not? You're aware that Officer Minshew is actually sitting in Mr. Bryan's truck when he gets the first download of this video, or attempted download.
Okay.
You could have let Mr. Bryan operate the vehicle and show you himself.
That would have been an option.
So it's when you say in here on page 3 something like this, that's not Mr. Bryan telling you how to move the vehicle. That's you moving the vehicle for the camera.
At Mr. Bryan's direction, that's correct.
So he told you to move that way.
Yes, sir.
And where did he tell you to drive that way? Directing your attention to page 3 of the transcript. Where is Mr. Bryan there directing you, telling you how to operate the vehicle?
The whole page. It starts off up at the top. Mr. Bryan states, all right, I'm staying on this side of the road and I'm ahead of him, but I'm not going that fast. There's speed. You can come on down and actually if you go to lines 10, he says, so then I speed up. He talks about how they almost met at the tree. He says, we're real close to each other. And I ask a question, you still going? He replies, yep, straight on through. I sped up a little bit more, a good bit. I kind of left him. And then,
you say
so he is directing this travel through the whole way. He's talking about speed and direction during this whole process.
And then you're saying something like this.
Yes, I'm asking for clarification. I'm asking Mr. Bryan, is what I'm doing with my vehicle the same as what he did on that day on February 23rd?
And after you've done it, you're getting him to agree with you.
I'm asking him a question. I want him to respond yes, if it is correct. And if it's not correct, I want him to respond no and tell me what the correct way is.
And this is all while people are walking through the neighborhood, while all this media craziness is going on. Is it not?
We've seen the video. There was, I don't recall seeing anybody on Burford at the point that we're talking about on page 3. I don't believe we start seeing people in the video until we get to the intersection of Holmes and Satilla. So at the point we're talking about here, there's not a whole bunch of people in the street.
But the media circus, while it's not evident in the few minutes of your video, you've already testified about the media circus in this time frame. About the march through the neighborhood, you've already testified about that, have you not?
I have. But the media circus is not just about what was happening in the neighborhood. There were times where there was media in the neighborhood. There were times that there were other people mulling about the neighborhood that did not appear to live there. But media circus also referenced a lot of other things that were going on beyond just physical activity in the neighborhood.
As you've already testified, Mr. Bryan is in fear for himself and his family.
Objection to mischaracterization and also speculation.
Mr. Bryan has expressed concern for his safety.
Yes, he has.
Okay. Mr. Bryan is trying to please you, is he not?
Objection to speculation about Mr. Bryan pleasing anyone, Judge.
Sustained.
Mr. Bryan is, you would describe this Mr. Bryan telling you what you want to hear?
No, sir. As a matter of fact, Mr. Bryan, even through your cross-examination today, says several times that he's having a hard time remembering. Somebody who's trying to please me would generally just want to answer in whatever way I'm trying to get them to answer. But Mr. Bryan is not doing that. So he's trying to remember what he can recall from 2.5 months before.
And when he's having trouble recalling, you're helping him along.
I can't help him along. I was not there that day. I can't provide those details. I'm not helping him along. I am asking questions, which is my job.
Then why won't you simply show him his statements?
Objection asked and answered, Your
sustained.
While you're sitting in the car and he's having trouble remembering details, why don't you just share them with him?
Like I said earlier, my goal here is to get his statement for that day of his recollection so that I can compare it as part of the investigative process. We actually have a team of investigators that are working this case. We're discussing it daily. We're going back and we're discussing differences. We want to see those differences so we can use that in the investigation to determine our path and what our decisions are going to be.
But when you've reviewed his prior statements and he can't see them, then he's looking to you to fill in the gaps. That's human nature.
Objection to speculation, Judge.
Sustained, let's go ahead and
Now,
it's sustained.
thank you. At page 4, you ask him, is this where Mr. Arbery went for the door?
Yes, sir.
And you're telling him, as you were coming in reverse.
Again, I'm not telling him. The transcripts, both of those quotes of what I said are questions. The first one, okay, is this where he went for the door, question mark? Mr. Bryan says yes. And then I respond, okay, are you coming in reverse? It's a question. Again, it goes back to the information he's already provided, and I'm just helping the narration from what he's already told me so that I can be sure that I understand, which is also in the question format, giving him the opportunity to respond if I've misunderstood it.
And while Mr. Bryan is talking to you, your phone rings during the video, does it not?
I believe hearing my phone ring somewhere in there. I think so.
It unfortunately interrupts Mr. Bryan at an important part of your reenactment.
When my phone rang, it did not ring continuously until it went to voicemail. My recollection is that I silenced it once it started ringing.
But Mr. Bryan corrects you in the actual audio of this video. He says, I might have been in drive by then, as opposed to being in reverse, as you testified to. You don't recall him saying that?
I don't recall. Yes, I recall him unsure of the exact time that he believed Mr. Arbery reached for the door. It was more of it happened quickly, and it either happened while I was in reverse or after I'd gone into drive. It was more of just a difficult in recalling the exact moment because of how quickly it occurred.
And Mr. Bryan added, which you did not mention today, I wasn't looking back there at him.
That's right. But again, I was paraphrasing the statement that Mr. Bryan gave me.
He was trying to figure out where Mr. Arbery was going and get out of here. That's what he told you.
That's correct. Right before he continued to chase Mr. Arbery down home the road.
Now, in the video, we see you pulling up by the ditch at a driveway where he's angled. You remember that?
Yes, that was
Okay.
before. Actually, that's right the same time frame. That's correct.
Now, when you're driving the car, when you back up, you're not backing up at the angle that Mr. Bryan is reported pulling in. You're not backing up the angle that you pulled in. You're backing up at an angle more towards Mr. Arbery.
I'm backing up at the direction of Mr. Bryan.
Where did Mr. Bryan tell you that he backed straight up? Where in that transcript does he tell you that?
He doesn't tell me that specifically, nor does he correct it the way that I'm doing it at that time.
Because maybe at that time Mr. Arbery doesn't understand that might be important.
Mr. Arbery?
Mr. Bryan.
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan understood at that time, Your Honor.
Because you still haven't explained to Mr. Bryan that you're looking at whether there's an aggravated assault.
Well, sustained. Was there a question there?
There is. When you're going through this part of this with Mr. Bryan, you have not told him that you're looking at an aggravated assault.
At this point in time, I'm still looking at the case as a whole and what his involvement was. I wouldn't even say that specifically at this time I was thinking about aggravated assault.
Okay. So neither you nor Mr. Bryan know that that angle has any actual importance at the time you're making this video.
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan knew at that time, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. You weren't deliberately trying to mislead Mr. Bryan when you angled, when you reversed in the way that you weren't deliberately trying to mislead him. It didn't occur to you at that time that it mattered.
I did not deliberately mislead Mr. Bryan at any time. The angle, the exact angle of how Mr. Bryan backed up, again, he did not correct what I did. And so that was the best representation of what I have as to what happened that day.
Now, as in the video, you show Mr. Bryan pulling up ahead. After the backing up, you show him pulling ahead. But in your testimony this morning, you didn't talk about the speed at which Mr. Bryan was moving.
Okay.
Mr. Bryan told you that that moment when he pulls away is the fastest that he's traveling during this entire incident, doesn't he?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But you didn't mention that.
Again, I didn't mention that. It was a paraphrase of what Mr. Bryan told me during that reenactment.
All right. Now, I believe you testified about Mr. Bryan backing up again, this time when he's driven past Holmes, correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
But when he's backing up, he's not backing up at Mr. Arbery, is he?
No, sir. Not to my knowledge.
Because Mr. Arbery's going up the other street.
I don't know the exact time that Mr. Arbery would have gone up the other street in relation to when Mr. Bryan was backing up.
I'm going to get this right before this trial is over. This little squiggle here, you see that?
Yes, sir.
That's pretty important in this case, isn't it?
Objection, Judge.
I'll rephrase.
To relevance about what Agent Seacrist.
I'll rephrase. In the entire interview you conducted with Mr. Bryan, did you ever ask him about Matt Albenzi?
Not to my recollection.
As far as your entire interview with Mr. Bryan has no idea where Mr. Albenzi is.
As far as I know.
But Mr. Arbery knows where Mr. Albenzi is.
Objection to what Mr. Arbery knew, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase.
Stay.
In your course of your investigation, you discovered that Mr. Arbery had run out of 220 Satilla,
That's correct.
the English residence,
Yes, sir.
and run down toward Mr. Bryan's residence.
That's correct. Well, towards, in that direction. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Bryan's got the music playing out front, right?
Yes, sir.
So he can't see or hear. He has no idea Mr. Albenzi's down there.
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan knew.
Sustained.
Do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Bryan was aware of Mr. Albenzi's presence out there?
Whether Mr. Bryan knew that Mr. Albenzi...
Yeah.
I don't know that Mr. Albenzi was still standing out there at that point in time.
But he had been there only minutes before.
He had been there at the time that Mr. Albenzi made the phone call to the non-emergency line. That's correct.
And that would explain why Mr. Arbery turns up the other street.
Objection to speculation about why the victim did what he did.
I'll move. But Mr. Bryan doesn't know any of that, does he?
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan knew.
Mr. Bryan doesn't tell you he's aware of that.
That's correct.
He tells you he's surprised that Mr. Arbery turns up Holmes.
Is that in the transcript?
I believe it is, but I'm not going to go look for the reference now. But you can.
Yeah. Let's just take a short moment. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, let's just go ahead and take a 5-minute recess.
All right for the jury.
I'm going to have you just step down for a moment. If you could just wait up. Oh, yes. Okay, we're going to take a short recess. Mr. Goff, how long are you planning to take with this witness? Because we spent a long time on one video, so I'm wondering where you're going with all of this.
I'm going to try and find a way to speed it up.
Well, I'm not asking you to speed it up. Well, it'd be great if you could. Obviously, I want to give you the opportunity, but I'm just trying to figure out from a timing standpoint where we are. I thought when we started we were in pretty good shape for the day.
I'd very much like to finish today.
I plan on finishing this witness today, so I'm trying to get some idea on where we are.
Pretty close, I think.
Okay. I have no idea what that means, but let's go ahead and take a short recess and we'll come back at it. Maybe we can get a better idea when I get back.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Off the record. We're up.
Please be seated.
We've got a juror file out. From the state, somebody wanted to go, let's check with the witness.
I will check with you.
Actually, I probably need to instruct the witness, so let's bring the witness in. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are at a point we're going to go ahead and break for the day. So we're going to ask that you be back here at 9 o'clock Monday morning for a continuation of the evidence in this case. Now we're breaking for the weekend. Okay, so let me just remind you of the instructions that I've given you. Again, do not discuss this case with anyone. Do not go looking for any information about the case. And don't let anybody discuss this case with you or approach you about the case. Don't let anybody talk about it in your presence of hearing. Don't go picking up newspapers. Don't go looking at social media. If you're out and about over the weekend and you are around people that are talking about the case or want to talk about the case, you need to walk away. You need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And if it does, you need to go ahead and notify the court when you return on Monday. Does everybody understand the court's instructions? Getting nods from everybody. All right. With that, thank you for the week. Thank you for participating in this case with us here in the Superior Court of Glenn County. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your attention. We'll see you Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.
All rise for the jury. Stated.
Anything from the state before we recess?
Nothing from the state.
From Travis McMichael.
No, Your Honor.
From Greg McMichael.
No, Your Honor.
From Roddy Bryan.
No, Your Honor.
All right, we will see everybody 9 o'clock Monday morning. Stay safe this weekend. Have a good weekend. Thank you.